I'm now over the chair of this session from my friend, colleague, Professor Ze'ev Tadmor, who in his introductory remarks this morning set the stage for the whole day's discussion. Then the remarks, the inputs from our guests from abroad and from our audience have filled this stage with a number of interesting ideas, which we now, in the afternoon session, intend to summarize, to cluster into separate categories, and to focus on a few of them. Now, in the preparatory remarks, which some of you have sent to this conference, you were guided by this memorandum that was produced by a team that prepared this session. The team was chaired by Professor Tadmor, and this manifesto, this memorandum, this paper outlines the basic issues and also the goals of the discussion. What do we want to achieve? Of course, what do we want to achieve can be interpreted. What do we want to achieve on a national level in developing our educational systems, but you can also interpret this question as what do we want to achieve today at our discussion. And we wanted to shed light and based on experience of our colleagues from different countries, from different educational systems, on issues of educational content, and we heard quite a lot about that. We wanted to learn about issues in multicultural societies, about differentiation, uniformity, integration, segregation, and we also heard about that. We also heard this morning about regulation, regularity processes, and about how an educational policy can be implemented. We also, in preparing this event, this conference, we had a hidden agenda which is not mentioned in this document, and that is we Israelis wanted to hear your experience and to see what we can learn and what we can apply to our system. And that was based on a certain concern which was reflected in this morning's contributions from our Israeli colleagues here who served in the past, and one of them at present, as Director Generals of the systems. And there was a sense that maybe our system is plagued by more severe problems than anywhere else because of political uncertainties, because of cultural internal differences, and maybe we shall also relate to that again in this afternoon's discussion. And if we take seriously the remark of by Brat, I think, your remark that although every country is different and maybe you can transplant an entire system from Texas to Jerusalem, there are still universal elements, and elements can be applied, and one can certainly learn from each other's experiences. Now, what we shall do this afternoon is a little different. In the morning, we had this broad arena. What we are trying in this afternoon to focus on 3 clusters of topics, specifically things or ideas that came up this morning and were, in a sense, new. new to, were not covered sufficiently by this document. And this is the broad question, and we shall start with that. And we shall first focus on these ideas. And this is the broad question of reforms. If we do not take too seriously the verdict that all reforms fail, and we do believe, we are a little more optimistic, we do believe, and we have to, otherwise we can go home, that there is a way to change complex systems effectively and to reach certain goals if you persevere, if you know what you do, and if you do it professionally. And the emphasis on this concept that you see here, how to improve complex systems, this whole cluster of ideas, this goal, and the certain concepts that were mentioned around that is this is will be the topic on which I would like that we focus in the first part of our discussion. Then we shall talk about another issue which was not covered here, was brought up first by Dr. Charlotte Frank and then very forcefully articulated by Eliezer Shmueli about what I call the content, the educational content which is outside of the traditional discipline. Not physics, math, and this, but this is a kind of socialization and values and character development. And in that context, one can also talk about informal input into the educational systems, like the internet, science museums, whatever. So this will be one thing which has become an important issue. And finally, if time permits, and I hope that it does, there is a whole set of issues that came up in our discussion this morning that has to do with the broader concept of regulation. Central versus decentral aspect, state, local regulation, or as we heard from Francois Mallet, the teachers themselves and nobody else, self-regulation at the very basic level. So all that will now be open to discussion, and I would like to begin, a little more focused than we did today in the morning. The main contributors who started this discussion and who led it was Professor Breik and Professor Barber, and I would like now to open the floor on these issues of how do we, if it's me, then I apologize. No. This reminds me to remind you. Okay. So we'll start with the first row. Yes.
Well, what I'd say about the first cluster, how to improve complex systems, is that in my view, the really important things you need to do to improve complex systems aren't there.
And they're
not there, no.
All right, that's great.
No.
Then
So
but there is a lot of space to add things there, you
right.
see?
There's nothing up there that I would want to argue against, but I think the most important thing you need to do to improve your system is to, and I'm echoing what Tony said earlier, and others, is the most important thing is to help the people in the system get better at what they do. So it's to build the capacity in the system so that people are better at their work. So attracting the best is good, but you can never attract enough of them. So you have to support the people you've got and help them get better. And there's a lot of things we could say around how you do that, but I'll just stop there for now.
Okay. Yes.
I wanted to add one piece on this, that the emerging evidence in the United States from the studies of Teach for America, that even attracting your best, which is, I argue, an important part of the system improvement, doesn't get you very far. That the studies on Teacher America, how well students do in their classrooms over the first few years, well, if you look at the mathematics work in secondary schools, yeah, they do a little better, but other subjects, other grade levels, different studies, the effects that are there are very small relative to the wide performance differences among classrooms in the United States. So that what that leads you to is, yes, you have to attract your best, but even more importantly, even new people coming in, even good new people coming in, have to be developed. And so this is basically a problem of developing people.
All right. Now, you see, a lot was said in the morning about the quality of teachers and how you go about improving that. But then I had the impression that some of you emphasized that if you talk about a large, complex system, it's important, maybe essential, but not enough in order to change the system. And that's why we suggested that we talk about this added requirements on top of improving the elements, the atoms of the system. What do you do at the macro level to change? Yes, please.
I completely agree with the remarks that Ben and Tony have made, that clearly you need to attract, as far as you can, good people into the system, and then you need to keep developing them through their careers, and that applies to not just to teachers, but to the other staff in schools, and particularly school leaders, where one of the most likely levers to bring results in the short and medium term is to improve the quality of school leadership. So all of that I agree with. But I wanted to just answer or help to contribute to the answer of this first question by saying, yes, you've got to do that. But the question is, how do you, what forms of pressure and support do you bring on systems to give people an incentive to improve? So you invest in their skills, you design good professional development programs, all of that is important. But how do you create the incentives in the system to make people want to keep learning and want to keep improving? And at the end of 10 years of reforming not just education but health and other things in England, we had what we call three paradigms of reform. I just want to introduce those. They're all different pressures on the system. One is what you might call a kind of top-down command and control model. So you say the government has a strategy, we're going to focus on this priority, maybe it's literacy, maybe it's numeracy, as in the case of Ben's reform in Ontario, and we're going to design a program, we're going to do it from the top, and we're going to make sure that the investment in professional development is good, we're going to hold people to account for their results. So there's a top-down, centrally conceived, centrally implemented, and if you do that well, you can get a short and medium-term gain in performance. If you do it badly, obviously, it's terrible. So if you're going to do top-down stuff, you've got to do it well. And if you've got a system that is significantly underperforming, it's a very sensible thing to think about for the first part of the strategy. Then the second model that Blair in particular got very interested in his second term was bringing market-like pressures into public systems. So not privatising them, but bringing market-like pressures, giving the citizen choice, bringing in alternative providers, so generating some kind of competition, money following the student. And that works in systems where choice can work well and where you're prepared to create the supply of new places as well as the demand for them. And it worked very well in our health reforms in England, for example. Works less well in school systems, although it's helpful because parents can't keep changing where their child goes to school, so it's not a very flexible system. But nevertheless, bringing in new supply, as in some parts of the US, as we've done in England a little bit, that can work and it does create a pressure on the system to improve. And then the third model that we adopted was where you can't keep doing command and control and top-down reforms for obvious reasons, but that will get you an improvement. Markets don't work perfectly in lots of situations, including education systems, although they can help. So the third model we had was what we call devolution and transparency, where you devolve power and responsibility, including budgets, to the front line, in this case the school. But you use accountability mechanisms to check how that money is being spent at school level and what results it's delivering, and use the transparency of the results as the pressure on the system to use the money wisely. And I think on your how to improve complex systems, you need to, people running the system need to have some concept of these three paradigms, or possibly others. And in any given system, you can combine them. So you could use the command and control bit for really underperforming schools. You can have market-like pressures, but they won't solve all your problems. And then you can use devolution and transparency. But having a concept of how you're trying to reform the whole system is an important starting point. And through all of those, Tony's point and Ben's point is right. The capacity building in the people has to go on whichever of those three paradigms you're using.
Very good. Anybody else wants to respond to this? Yes?
I mean, I would just say with Teach First, there was recently a British government initiative saying, can we train teachers in 6 months as opposed to a year, and using sort of Teach First as
He spoke to the mic.
Oh, sorry, I didn't do it on the mic.
Then she cannot translate you.
Okay, sorry. I was basically going to agree with what people said just now, that some of the lessons people take from Teach First, I think, are the wrong lessons in Britain. And the wrong lessons are, we train them in 6 weeks, and then they start schools, and they're brilliant teachers. That's not how we see the program. When we see the program, it's a 2-year support program. If you add everything together, our teachers get a lot more support and training and development, and further development after 2 years than most normal teachers. And actually, so I would totally agree with what Bill said, that you need to get the best people, but then the best people, to get excited and to do well and to stay in the system, need to feel that they're constantly being trained and supported and developed and really pushed to their limit, and actually supported to be pushed to their limit. So it's actually 2 sides of the same thing, I would say.
Yes? Vital.
Can I add a question?
One moment, wait. A moment. Vital Darmon.
Can I add a question or 2 questions, please?
On this. Yes, please do.
And I want to listen to...
The microphone.
Talk to the microphone.
Sorry.
I just...
The light is on and off. It's not... Does it work now?
Yes. You have to hold it to your mouth.
Thank you. I would like to combine Carlos' question about complex systems, thanking Dalimbar and Dalim also for this wonderful day. 2 things mentioned before about the liberology and something about learning from experience. In complex systems, in open systems, you cannot ignore the end users as knowledge producers. And this was not mentioned here today. And while you want to build on the capacity of existing teachers and school principals and inspectors, it wasn't mentioned, how we combine those 2 different attitudes to knowledge, and whether research can help peer learning of practitioners to improve practice. So this would be the first question. And the second would be, any kind of trying to figure out what a complex system is, I believe, demands some data collection. And it was mentioned here that many of the things that were proven to be effective were proven by some kind of longitudinal study, surveys of populations, and I would love to hear something about this. What are the minimal needs on data collection that the system, somebody who wants to look at the system would need, because we're not used to this kind of thinking and long-term data collection in Israel, I'm afraid, and I think it would help us to learn something from other countries.
Thank you very much. Do you want to respond, or
I was going to build on that point.
to build on that point? So please do.
Is this on? All right. It's a small comment, but it picks up the end user's point. With the people I work at in the United States, one thing that we would probably want to do to this diagram would be to push all 3 of those clusters to the side and in the middle to put instruction. That all of this activity needs to be coordinated with some ambition for the day-to-day work of teachers and students in classrooms. And if it's not coordinated with some ambition for instruction, with some ambition for the end users of all of this, then quite a lot of it could go for naught. So finding a place up there to capture the focus of all of this activity, which would be improving the day-to-day work of teachers and students.
Okay. Now, yes, Charlotte Frank.
I would like to build upon the Teach for America study. Now, it depends upon the question that is asked. Did all the, the impact of the teachers in the class, Teach for America teachers in the classroom, did they have an impact on the students? A much broader question would be. I'm not on? I'm on?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I didn't really want to off.
You are on all the time.
Okay, thank you very much. You're my PR guy. One of the things to think about is the impact of the folks who decide to go for TFA, Teach for America. One would have to realize that many of the Teach for America folks became leaders of educational organizations, and they became like the head of the KIPP schools. They became a head of lots of other organizations like that. They also, excuse me?
I'm sorry, Michelle Reed.
Yeah, Michelle Reed, the superintendent in Washington, D.C. I was in Mumbai and looking with the Asia Society, and we were looking at a whole educational system that was being built with all of these slum kids. But this young woman, I say to her, I know you look like you're from India, but you don't sound like you're from India. So she says, I was for Teach for America. And she says, I want to have a Teach for India. So these are the kinds of impact that these TFA young people have, they haven't just stayed in the classroom, but they may not have, but they have pursued other very important roles and have, documented change. So it really depends on the research. What is the question asked, and how are you looking at it?
Yes, Tony.
Just on that point, I'm a terrific fan of Teach for America for precisely the reasons that have been described. But the only point is that the evidence is also clear that simply attracting the best and the brightest doesn't solve the performance problem in the classroom. You also have to work, as Brett was mentioning, on the issue about how you actually support them to learn to teach. It's the capacity building side. You only get so far with attracting talent. You also have to develop them. And in this diagram up here, one of the things that I would add as a big concept, in addition to getting the accountability systems right, which is what Michael was talking about before, is what I would call the knowledge development and management systems. What is it you really need to know about what's really going on inside your system if you're really going to inform a continuous improvement process? And yes, that's the data about student outcomes, but there's a lot that sits between the policy and the student outcomes. A whole set of processes that have to be, that are in that cascade that Michael was talking about before, a whole set of processes that have to be considered, any one of which may simply not be functioning and may be undermining the intervention. And so there is a whole piece of that becomes part of the system development strategy.
Yeah, but that's only part of an answer to Avital's questions about research and database collection.
Right.
You want to elaborate a bit more on her questions? Or?
I'm very happy to. Is this working?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah? Okay. I just wanted to add to that. I think it's a very important question. And basically, the best reforming systems, I'm not just talking about education systems now, are the people at the front line who are doing the work for, in the case of the school system, for the students, are learning day to day from the evidence they see in front of them. So they're what we call in England assessment for learning, that goes under a variety of different names around the world. That the teacher has the skill to assess at the end of the lesson, or during the lesson even, whether all the students are learning or not, or what they need to do differently. They're often planning lessons together, teachers, so they're doing planning work together, and then they're looking at the student work that comes from their different lessons, and they're using that evidence to inform their practice. But that's the classroom level evidence and data feedback loop that you need. And then, as Tony's saying, you need that all the way up the system. And I think one of the big breakthroughs we're going to see in the next 5 years is really fantastic data systems informing decision-making at every level in education systems. It's a huge initiative for the Obama administration in the US now. And I noticed in the morning session a number of school systems, including European ones, who were saying we're introducing national testing or national assessment. Part of the reason for that is for accountability. Part of it is to get the data of real quality. In Australia, they're introducing a national curriculum with tests at 4 ages. So we're going to see a big improvement in the quality of data systems. And then the second part of the question is, what that will enable is the best teachers and school leaders to be the key leaders of the changes. I mean, generally speaking, good reforms aren't dreamt up in government buildings. They're something that, through the evidence or visits, the government representatives have seen, and they decide to translate it into a national programme. And all the evidence suggests, if you look at Ben's literacy programme, or ours in England, or what they did recently in Boston and New York, just for example, is the best professional development is provided by really good professionals who understand how to teach literacy, and they're training their peers. So in fact, the peer-to-peer learning is absolutely fundamental, but it needs to be within a whole system design. So the quality of the data, the use of professionals as the leaders of the change, and all that will be absolutely crucial.
Ben, you want to add to that?
No, I'm just going to introduce another issue. So
in this cluster,
yes.
In this context.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
So I think another element we need to pay attention to is the political. And you know, in education we tend not to like the political, and we've heard a lot of references to that this morning. But the reality is, it all depends on that. So if you're going to improve a complex, large system, you need a small number of clearly stated goals sustained as priorities over multiple years. You don't have that, you cannot make any progress. A small number of goals that are easy to understand and that don't change over several years.
Yeah. There is a question from there, and then I'll come back to you. One question from the audience, and then I'll come back. Shh. One moment. Where is the microphone? Where is the mic? No. Yeah, he's a former CEO of Intel Israel, so.
No, that's unfair. Speaking about the complex systems, a question actually I would like to pick upon the international experience that is residing in this room. Part of the reason the system is complex is the presence of many stakeholders that we need to pretty much associate with. The union was mentioned here. I think it was also mentioned the local municipalities, academia, many others are pretty much part of these complex systems. I'm curious to learn from the international experience here, specifically speaking about teachers' policy, about reforms that have been designed and been implemented in a collaborative manner. Meaning, I think it's a kind of interesting debate, I think, here in this country lately, the recent years, about is it something to wish for, or is it doable and collaborative in the wide scale? Speaking not only union, really all the other stakeholders that have to say something about it. So, would appreciate your comments in reference to this challenge.
Okay. Ronit, and then will be your turn.
I think in order to improve complex systems, you must clarify to the whole end users, and I mean, I'm talking about teachers especially, every teacher, to make sure that he understands exactly what is the policy, what is the aim of the programs or the reform you are making, and you must, of course, define standards that can help you bring the children, the students, to
policy. And although I heard a few remarks about and also criticism about controlling or not controlling the work of the teachers, I still think that you must give a few, I don't know if it's the right translation, spots in the time, you know, that you must give time slots, right? That you must give the teachers understand where they are standing comparing to other classes or other schools in the same level, socioeconomic, geographically, I mean, between classes and schools that you can compare. And every teacher can use this data in order to assess and evaluate his performance and his children's performance. So this brings us the authority of the ministry must make some control and of this kind of performance.
Thank you. Yes, please.
I want to confirm what Ben said about just a few goals, just a few aims. If you want to change something, you really have to focus. And I've heard several times that in Israel, after 1 year there is another minister, and after another 1 year there is another minister. What we try to do, and although it's quite difficult, to think of reforms and set certain milestones. Not a milestone just for this government, but also some for the next one and the next one, so they also can join the party and think of it as a good policy, what's also part of them. So in this way, you can try to be continuous on some kind of policy. At least is what we try to do. We change less ministers, but also in other countries, it's quite something we have to deal with. On the question of collaboration and working together, we have agendas for this government for primary education, secondary education, tertiary education, higher education, and these agendas are the government, but they came there after talking with all the stakeholders of those groups. But what's the, and that's because we have a tradition in this talking together, that's not the point. But what's the main goal is how to do focus. If you look at our agendas, sometimes they do have too many aims, too many goals. So the thing is more. It's not too difficult to talk with anyone and to get a consensus on a lot of subjects. But it's more difficult to get consensus on some focus needs. Thank you.
Thank you. Shlomit, Amichai, you want? No. No, you are first. Shlomit. All right. Shlomit will speak Hebrew, and I should later summarize what she... Yeah, there is a translation. Okay.
Not all of us have.
אני מדברת מתוך שלומית אביחי בביקות, המיקרופון. אני מדבר מתוך ניסיון, אני חושבת, של כמה שנים, לא רק 3 שנים, אלא יותר מזה, שפה בישראל ניסינו ליישם הלכה למעשה רפורמה. זה התחיל בדוברת, המשיך בוורסיה של חלק מדוברת, המשיך להיות מיושם, ומה שקרוי היום אופק חדש, שבחלקו בנוי על העקרונות של העקרונות של דוברת, ובחלקו הוא הסכמה עם ארגוני מורים, שזה אחד מהעקרונות החייבים של רפורמה שכזאת. הצורך לומר מצד אחד פוקוס, מצד שני הביטחון שאם לא נטפל בכמה גורמים באותה שעה, אזי לא עשינו את השינוי, הוא איזשהו דילמה שעוסקים בה כל הזמן בזמן הניסוי. ומתוך הדברים שעלו כאן ומתוך הניסיון, יש כמה דברים שחייבים לעסוק בהם בבת אחת. ואי אפשר לתת פה עדיפות לנושא אחד, לחכות שנתיים ולהמשיך. האחד, ודובר עליו רבות, ולצערי אנחנו לא בוודאות עוסקים בו מספיק, זה הנושא הציבורי, השיח הפתוח עם הציבור, עם הורים, עם רשויות מקומיות, עם מורים, לא במסגרת המובנית שלנו, אלא כשיח פתוח, לשמוע דעות ולשוחח. ולרתום את הציבור לרפורמה, ולרתום בחיוב, לא בשלילה, לא כל הזמן להצליף ולספר לנו כמה אנחנו רעים. כי צריך להגיד את האמת, אנחנו לא כל כך רעים. המדינה הזאת עשתה ב-60 שנותיה המון בחינוך, ומצב קשה אולי יותר מרבות מהמדינות גם שהן נמצאות פה. אז שוכחים את הטוב ומצליפים רק ברע. אני אומרת, חייבים להיות פוזיטיביים. לזה צריך להמשיך ולדבר על הנושא של המורים, וחייבים לדבר על שכר המורים. אי אפשר, מורה, זה נכון שהשכר הוא לא הכל, אבל המינימום חייב להיות, ואנחנו ב-OECD, השכר המורים הוא הנמוך ביותר במדינות ה-OECD. צריך לזכור את זה. צריך לדבר על התכנים, ודיברנו, ואולי בהמשך ידובר על זה, על המנגינות הסותרות בתכנים, מפוקוס או להרחיב, לתת גם מתקשים ומה ללמוד. ונושא המנהלים, הכשרת המורים, ולבסוף אני רוצה מילה על הערכה. תראו, הערכה זה כלי פנטסטי לשפר כל הזמן את מה שקורה בכיתה, בבית הספר, ביישוב, בכל מקום. כשהערכה הופכת להיות שוט, להצליף כל הזמן במורים, במנהלים, במפקחים, בעובדי משרד החינוך, היא הופכת לכלי מסוכן, כלי גרוע, כלי שלוקח את כולנו למינימום ההכרחי כדי להצליח בהערכה. זה צריך מאוד להיזהר כשעוסקים בנושא הערכה. תודה.
Thank you, Shlomit. Let me just try to summarize what Shlomit said. Although most of you heard the translation, yeah, it was also typed, but I want to put it into, I think it was a very important contribution and very timely at the stage of our discussion now, because although the organizers, when they prepared this conference, they had in mind something to bring together experts and to have an academic conference on the issues of vision, policy and implementation, on the problems of the interaction between these three elements, whether it is such a linear process, what is the feedback. But actually at the back of everybody's mind was the failure of a very ambitious Israeli attempt to change our system in a one-sweep reform. A lot of time, energy and resources and commitment, as we heard from Shlomit Amichai, was invested in that, yet it failed. And maybe it failed because of certain elements that here are part of essential elements of the process that were not there. And therefore, many of us here, like people who were involved in this process, when they participate in this discussion, they have all this in mind. So thank you for, yes? It didn't fail yet, but it was... All right. I stand corrected, although the person who was associated with that had a sense of not success. Yes. Gabi Motzkin, please.
I think it's very important to distinguish when we say something's failed. It's just a kind of point between two different kinds of failure. Failure to implement the reform, and the reform itself fails even though it's been successfully implemented. I think these two questions are somewhat confused because what happens in most reforms, and especially in the ones we're talking about, is that it's implemented in part. And because it's implemented in part, you don't always know whether implementation in part is better than no implementation or than total implementation. That's the other point, which is that the curve between no implementation and full implementation is not just simply progressive. It has dips and curves and different thresholds, and you have to define, I think, in the reform what you expect to achieve if you only get certain parts done in a phased way, because you must know at the beginning that it's highly unlikely, at least in our fractionated political system, that you're going to get through the whole phase.
Okay, Françoise Mallet.
It's just a small statement about trade unions and teachers more generally, because I'm not an inspector, so I'm not so much in policy making, but I see teachers in the classroom. And I think they think they are the front line, not schools, as you say, Margaret. And since we all have a limited amount of energy and time, I think they think that on the whole for the past 10 or 15 years, we have invested too much time and too much money and too much energy in all that is happening at management level. All this data collecting and setting targets and assessing results, and so time consuming. And I think many of them can't see all this process as helping teachers so much. I think they see the whole past decade as managers talking to managers, national managers talking to local managers, and they still the same students and the same difficulties in the classroom. And so somehow, I think the British have a wonderful theory about how to implement policies, but we have come again and again against this difficulty that teachers see themselves rather as craftsmen. It's not an industry that you run with targets and results and things like that. It's human relationship and it's craftsmanship for most of them. So I think they do enter the way we want to implement policies.
All right. There will be two contributions from there, then and then four more contributions, and then we shall try to summarize this topic. All right, Eliezer Shmueli.
I would say the main problem, speaking of teachers in the system, is economic one. The social status of a teacher in our country is different from other countries. Let me remind you that after the Second World War, two educational systems actually were destroyed totally, Germany and Japan. And it's amazing to see today that both systems, Japan and Germany, are leading today, as far as education is concerned, by the best teachers. The question is why? When I graduated from a teacher's college many years ago, a poet called Zalman Schneer was invited to be the keynote speaker. And he told us, dear graduates, I pity you because you are going to grow in poverty. The teachers in the state of Israel actually have no chance to stay in their jobs with a salary that is a poor salary for somebody that graduated with BA or MA and is getting less than every clerk in an office of a lawyer. This is why we're talking about all these big, important things, that let us remind ourselves. We had a special committee called the Esioni Committee approximately 15 years ago. They promised the teacher system, they promised the teachers union that the state of Israel must multiple the salary of the teachers. Nothing since then happened. And I'm sure that today, if you go into any secondary school and ask the graduates of secondary schools who would like to go into teaching, you'll see that there will be hardly people that will raise their hands.
Okay.
Let's pay them well, let's improve the social status, and then let's talk about
very good, but you heard from many of the people who took part in this discussion that this may be very important, but even this is not enough if you want to reform a complex system. And that's what we are talking about now. And Dan Sharon.
What I fear in discussions like the one we are having today, which is a very interesting and highly developed discussion, is that the bigger terms, complex systems, and the like, mask our vision about the real things. And after all, we are talking about one school in Shlomi or in another place, and this school has to be improved. It has its population and teachers and conditions and so forth. And let's go for a second to the micro and look at the school. This is where we want to act. So first of all, I think that every decision, all decision makers need to have a complete and true picture. How does it look to be a teacher in a classroom there? What is the composition of students? What is their background? What are their motivations? What language do they speak? And what are their interests? And etc., etc. This means we cannot suffice ourselves with partial information. For instance, if you're talking about secondary schools today, do you know how old this model in our society is today? Since when do we have such a construction of schools? If we look at it, we see that these schools, I mean the theoretical schools, were conceived based on a very strong home, supporting the students with knowledge, background, and motivation, and goals for their lives, etc., etc., etc. Now, this part of our complex situation, which we call education today, is missing. Home isn't there anymore, both in the higher echelons, where parents both are busy, as well as in the lower ones. So we must understand that in order to build a relevant model, we have to take into account this situation. So all in all, just to sum it up, I think that we have to question a few very, very basic questions, such as the construction of the classroom. Can it work or doesn't, or can it not? We need to ask the question whether the construction and the organization called school can give us the right answers or not, maybe not. And do we have to do other things to supplement school's operation? Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. You see, you are talking about a single school, and it is essential about a school. It's essential, it's important, it's the contents. We talked about this more. But if we follow what Ben Levine said, or François Mallet, or others here, that if you want to change a system, you have to have in mind 5,000 schools at once, 70,000 schools at once. And the question is, I mean, and this is our discussion now. And yes, your turn.
I am afraid I'm not as familiar as I should be with your own situation here on reforms, but it struck me, and I say this as a senior public servant in a country where we are not political appointees. So in fairness to politicians, I think in my country and in most countries, if you find that policies are chopping and changing, it's often because maybe we have not, as educators or administrators, provided for sufficient public debate on the issue to perhaps get a consensus among our stakeholders. Because often when there is a consensus among all your stakeholders, or indeed there is evidence about different issues, then that's the pressure that builds on the political people to deliver. Now, I'm not saying there are not local issues about the local schools, or you can produce all the evidence you like in my country about the critical mass needed of a hospital, and you will still have a big political issue about small local hospitals. So I'm not just saying it's only about that. I'm not in terms of, so I think an interesting issue, and it was raised a bit earlier, is how you can build that type of debate and consensus. And we have tried different things. We had a big education convention back in the 1990s. It resulted in some reforms that were introduced and some that were very hotly contested, and the government changed, and that part was abolished. So yes, that is something you kind of live with. But I do insofar as one can involve stakeholders, there's a risk then you have multiple goals. In my experience in our country, there is usually consensus on the objectives, and when ministers change or a government changes, it's the how that often is the contested piece, rather than an acceptance that, for example, we should be worried if everybody is not literate or numerate, or we should be worried we want to disadvantage students to participate more. So the bigger objectives are often agreed on. It's the what methods you need to use, and maybe that's a place that evidence from other countries or information can help the debate more. Just on one issue I think raised by one of your speakers about an example of teacher involvement, and I just throw it in as an example from my country. We have a system of curriculum reform which would have been very heavily driven by partnership. All our curriculum committees are based on teacher representative, parent representative, management bodies of schools, specialist teachers and universities who develop curriculum. It's then rolled out as a new curriculum for a particular subject perhaps, or for a whole integrated suite of subjects with teacher in-service supports for teachers. But in fact what we're now experimenting with in maths, which has been a particular issue about how we teach maths, our inspection reports show maths teaching is perhaps not as good as other areas. We also have issues about the content of the curriculum. We actually are now experimenting with an almost live curriculum development, where we are designing and developing curriculum in schools and going to run parallel assessment systems for the old and the new curriculum, and develop the curriculum almost by doing, so that we actually have the teachers see how effective that is as a technique, with some good benefits we hope for teacher education, because it may also show us what models of supporting teachers to change their teaching practice, which is also necessary in the curriculum, may work and which don't. Now there is a risk you take the good students, we have to say, a spread of schools that were maybe stronger and weaker. So that's one example where I think you can actually buy direct teacher participation or school participation, and perhaps go from the individual school, which I think was referred to as what works in the individual school. Just on the issue of supporting capacity and teachers, I think there are choices which are either the one that we refer to, or maybe mixes of the tool that says, here you are, this is how your school is performing, these are how your individual schools, and you're terrible, you're 50 out of 50 schools in the locality, or other people if you're saying catchment. Or you have systems that rely on networks of teachers and networks of leaders and school leaders, and try and encourage best practice by people seeing what others do. And I think that can be encouraged, and that capacity builds, that can be very, very effective. It is an issue if you have, in our country, very small schools. We have half our primary schools have less than 100 pupils. So, in fact, if we're talking about building capacity in a system, even in our second level schools are relatively small, so how you get a collection of teachers to school improvement will rely on networks across schools. So I think the capacity building issue may depend on the scale of your system, and there may be different ways of doing that depending on the scale of your system and dispersal.
Now, the way we shall proceed, I have 3 more questions or remarks on my list, and then I shall ask Michael Barber to summarize this part of the discussion, and then we go on to the next subject. Pierre Kletz.
Yeah, my name is Pierre Kletz.
Pierre Kletz, not.
And I work in the. So my name is Pierre, and I work in the Mandel Foundation in Jerusalem. It seems we have a question: how to improve complex systems? What I heard in the last 10 minutes is a good sum up of what we heard. Mr. Dancharon tells us, at the end of the day, eventually, nothing, if it doesn't happen in the classroom, it won't happen. So we have to focus on the classroom. And I heard Mrs. McManus, who says, okay, that maybe we should think about what is the reform, and there is very conditions. Public debates, to have an agreement about it, no multiple goals, support teachers, etc., etc. So it's It seems to me that we are looking, on the other hand, if we have to implement a policy, what are the best practices? But my questions would be just this. Can we really believe that such a good, one best way for reform could exist? It means that in the world of organizations, it's a long time that we know that there is no such a thing as one best way. It depends on the context. It's totally contingent. I heard Mr. Barber to tell us, if you want to implement a reform, we have 3 ways to make it easier, etc. Is it totally stupid to say that it depends too on the content of the reform, but there is a link between the way to implement a reform and the content of the reform?
Okay. Professor Chaim Adler.
I apologize for not having been here in the morning.
Speak to the microphone, please.
I apologize for not having been here in the morning. I had to speak at some other education conference which is taking place today. And if what I say came up in the morning, what I was saying is I apologize for not having been here in the morning because I participated in some other education conference which takes place today. And if anything I say now has been discussed in the morning, please stop me. But in line with Dan Sharon and Pierre, I'd like to say the following 2 linked things. One is that I heard a lot about national curriculum. Now, what is this national curriculum? If it is about trying to produce, quote unquote, honest and loyal and I don't know, music lovers, that's terrific. If it aims at providing all our youngsters with basic learning skills, reading comprehension, arithmetic, some foreign language, fine. But if it also means a whole list of content subjects which everybody in the country is expected to study and to know or to be tested on, this is almost, in my opinion, it is close to being ridiculous. We have tall and small, we have north and south, we have poor and rich, we have ethnic minorities, we have lower class people, we have new immigrants, and the notion that all of them are going to be exposed to the same curriculum and motivated to study it, motivated to devote time and to devote limited to it, I think this is an assumption which is incorrect. And yeah, my experience, I'm a sociologist of education, my experience is mostly with the Israeli situation, but I'm not sure that it is a unique Israeli remark. And this leads me to the second thing, namely, by forcing all our students to study more or less the same stuff, and then to be examined on that, means, in order to get a matriculation certificate, in order to be college-bound, which in most countries not more than 50% of the student body, maybe 60% of the student body master, what we really create is an instrumental approach to culture. We don't let the kids develop some intrinsic attachment, either history or physics or arts, but having forced on them all these curricula, and usually, by the way, they are heavy, and testing them on that as a condition for further education or for further things in life. Yeah, indeed a brief remark.
Following Bridget's comment and complex systems and public discourse and assessment, I think it would be fair to say that in Israel, the universities on the higher education system, on the educational system, certain standards, that the politicians try to break it down repeatedly. I remember one Minister of Education told me, we'll break your system open admittance and so on. But we didn't do that. We maintained the standards. The educational system tries to meet those standards, and the public supported us. The public wanted universities of quality in this country and objected to breaking them down and converting them into wide open institutions with no standards. So motivating the public, standing up to politicians, and we could afford it in universities because we are in a certain way position of power, and both Chanoch and I were at that time members of Council of the Presidents of the universities. And it worked. And it was an external assessment of what happens in the system, and motivating the people and the public discourse, which was very useful in that case.
All right, thank you. Michael, please. It's your turn to summarize this part.
I'm not sure if I'm grateful to have the opportunity of summarising such a debate, but thank you anyway. It would be. I'm very glad there's a record, because it would be impossible to do justice to all the contributions that have been made, but I want to just pull out a handful of points. First of all, while the response suggested everybody knows it's difficult, Ben's point, reinforced by Dutch colleagues, that if you're going to reform something as complex as an education system, to have a few goals that you pursue persistently over a long period of time is very important. And while it's difficult to get the necessary political leadership, that really helps if you've got great political leadership, as indeed Ben does have. And if you haven't, you have to employ some of the strategies described by our Dutch colleagues, and that many of you are masters of, but you're probably too shy to say so. The second thing, you need a model of accountability, some form of accountability that comes through in this, and there are different models being debated, and I think one colleague sitting further back there pointed out that you have to take account of the context, the nature of the reform, but some form of accountability, in other words, finding out what is being provided, delivered, whether it's satisfaction of citizens or whether it's particular outcomes, but is necessary. Thirdly, the point made by Tony Reich and reinforced by others, there needs to be at the centre of this system reform an approach to building the capacity of teachers, leaders, and so you want to recruit the best people if you can, but whatever you do, all the people in the system, there needs to be serious investment in constantly improving their skills and capacity over a period of time. Fourthly, people made the point that you need, in order to do that, you need a really good knowledge management system. You need good ways of collecting evidence from the front line and from all the levels up. You need to inform the system with that evidence, and you need to manage that knowledge so that it's shared at classroom level, school level, intermediate tier level, if there is one in the system, and at the centre of the system. Fifthly, people have made the point that the teaching profession, one way or another, needs to be actively involved in this dialogue. And the relationship between a government and a teaching profession will vary over time, and it will have ups and downs. But in the end, if the reform is to be deep and successful, there has to be a serious dialogue there to make it work. At the very least, teachers need to understand over time what the strategy is. Ideally, they should be playing a part in creating the knowledge, providing the professional development, and indeed, as we often talk about in England now, leading the system wherever that's possible. Final point I want to make, it relates to the point Francois made about the risk of getting so caught in kind of management jargon about reform that you reform absolutely everything except what teachers do all day, and they feel completely divorced from the system. And obviously, if teachers aren't involved and the reform changes everything except what teachers do in their classroom, you're not going to get the desired result. And so my thought was to try and provide a single question that would help lead to the answers on this, this question of system reform. And I think the single question that I'd like to propose is this: how do you create circumstances in a system in which each teacher can go to each class with the skills, knowledge, data, ambition, materials, and surrounding ethos to teach a great lesson every time. If you answer that question, your system will improve.
This is the vision, right?
And as that famous English novel said a few weeks ago, the answer is 48.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Michael. And now, to remind you that in the morning, there was beginning of a discussion. It was, as I mentioned in my introductory remark, it started by Charlotte Frank about the character development or character education. I remember Françoise Mallet mentioned in her remarks that one of the problems of the educational system of the 70,000 schools is that in France today there is no sense of national unity. Is it in other countries? I mean, things like that or issues like that were referred to. In Israel, we talked about that a little bit in the morning session. The question is whether this is the role, our sense is that this is also one of the roles of the educational system, the national education system, kind of socialization, kind of thing that Chaim Adler mentioned at the end of his remarks. So the feeling was that we did not paid enough attention to this issue. So now is the time, if anybody wants to respond to that, to illuminate this question. And then we shall expand it a little more and maybe also relate to other non-disciplinary issues of the educational system or educational policy. So is there anybody who wants to lead the discussion? Yes, Ben.
I'll chip in on this because to me they're not two discussions, they're one discussion.
All right.
And I would say the central point is that you cannot get to good outcomes, academic outcomes, unless you are also paying attention to all the emotional engagement, character, and other issues, equity issues. So if you aren't paying attention to pupil sense and parent sense of belonging, you cannot get the academic outcomes you want either. And so the two things to me are inextricably connected and actually have to be seen as part of the same strategy. In the same way I would say that ICT is not a goal in itself. The goal is to improve student outcomes. ICT may be one means, is one means of changing teaching and learning practices in a way that produce better outcomes. If it is, we should be using it. If it isn't, we shouldn't be using it. So to me, it is all about how you improve student outcomes and the equity in those outcomes. And if you're committed to that, then you must deal both with the academic side and what we might call the non-academic side.
Anybody? Charlotte?
If I have the microphone. Somebody must have it. Otherwise, I'll give you my voice.
You're getting it. No, you're getting it. It's coming.
Can't control students in a cafeteria without having a cafeteria voice. Okay. Am I on?
Yes, you are.
All right. What Ben has said is absolutely correct. We're talking about the climate, the culture in that classroom. What's also happening at home. All of these things have to be brought together. You brought up the issue of the technology. Cyberbullying is really an issue. I know in New York we had a major meeting at the New York Public Library on this. I mean, a lot of things now people may not have wanted to say in person, but they're now saying it, in this new technology. So there's got to be a sensitivity to that. We can't teach the mathematics. The kid can't do that if he's afraid to come to school. There's got to be a climate of wanting to be there. All of those things. So this is not like an add-on. This is very much the culture, the climate, the quality the wanting to be there. You know that we have all these absences. Kids don't go to school because they're afraid to go to school. Or if they go to school, they're like this. Or if the teacher, you know, kind of reprimands or something, the kid isn't going to hit the teacher. The kid is going to go like that to the kid next to him. I mean, these are realities. And we can deal with all these esoteric issues. But we have to have a kid who wants to go to school. We have to have a kid feel that, you know, this kid is having some trouble. I'm going to try and help him in his math class. You know, I'm going to try and help him in a math problem. We need to have teachers want to work with each other. We need to have students want to work with each other. If you're a superintendent or however it is, you need to have your people working together.
Now, I would just raise a question to some of you who were involved in implementation of policies in your own countries as Director Generals of Systems. How, on your own working agenda, I mean, with these issues, did you have to deal with these issues, or were they just between the policymakers and the teachers? What was the role that you played in performing this function of the educational system as Director Generals?
I'll just add a piece. I at one time was the head of curriculum instruction for New York City. There was once a time when somebody was being assaulted in an alleyway in a place called Queens. And she was really screaming, somebody called Kenny Genovese. And it became a real issue that people heard her screaming in the neighborhood, and nobody did anything. Nobody came to her help. So the then Mayor Koch talked about implementation, and Mayor Koch calls me and says, Charlotte, you have to do something about that. Kids have to do something. I mean, kids have to learn. They have to help. The families have to learn. So if you want to know, here's a practitioner who's being told by the mayor of the city that this is a responsibility of an educational system. I didn't call it character education then. I called it citizenship in New York City. But then I had the fire department guy say, we have to also do something because there are too many kids pulling the fire alarms. And there's somebody else that's all throwing, I mean, it's all this other stuff. But they go to the school system for the solutions. It still calls about the quality of life in the community.
Anybody here wants to respond? Yes, please.
Well, it's hard to say what I do as a Director General, but perhaps I can explain something what we try to do in the Netherlands with this kind of problems. When I said we have attainment targets quite a broad way, it's also about socialization. Socialization is one of the attainment targets. Our inspector, when they visit school, they also take into account how socialization program is in the curricula given hands. So that kind of stuff. So about bullying, they take into account if there is an agreement on bullying and how to handle when it happens. If it's really out of hand, we have a lot of discussion that the school is a place where you can find the child, where you can find the student. That's the reason why all the problems go to the schools, and the teachers can't handle it. So that's quite a problem. What we try to, we do have what we call care advice teams. We try to have around the school some kind of experts to deal with it. So the teacher can ask those people what to do, or have discussions with the parents. You should do that to improve your child on behavior or whatsoever. If it's really get a problem, so those children can take it out of the schools in a special program for 2 or 3 months to get special attention, and later on they can be brought back to the school where they came from. That's how we try to do it. On the other hand, we also have what we call brede school, broad schools. So we just
we try to build schools with all kind of other facilities around it. So the teacher is not alone in solving this problem, but can handle it with the other people around. It's an attempt to deal with it.
Any, Gabi Motzkin?
Yeah, I would like to raise another aspect of this, which I raised before, maybe a bit of a hobby horse. But the question that I have is this: if one confronts new technologies, then obviously, if one confronts the new technologies, then obviously that one will have to do this in the future in a structured way. In other words, for each level of schooling, elementary, junior high, high school, however your systems are organized, the question will be how the internet will differentially affect learning or using those computer tools at different aspects. We saw this at the university when it came to the question of distance learning or using smart classrooms and all the rest. For instance, one of the things we noticed before the internet was what pressure existed on doing homework and how the nature of homework had changed over the last 40 years in terms of what the relation was between what was learned in class and what could be learned out of class. Now, perhaps it could be that these new communicative tools are changing the equation once again of what the relationship is between what one learns inside the classroom and outside of it.
Okay. Anybody else wants to respond to this? Yes, Michael?
I think this is a very important question, but systems find it very hard to structure the question in a way that it gets the right answer, because it often gets presented, as Ben was indicating, as a false dichotomy between academic standards and wider character education, whereas actually systems need to attempt to do both. You asked about direct experience of this. I once made a speech to the National Conference of Head Teachers in England on, I call it the ethics of school reform. Got into this wider issue, and I thought the speech had gone quite well. But the next day, the front page of one of the daily newspapers in England had the headline, "Blair Advisor Promises Code of Ethics to Replace God." And this got me in a lot of trouble. I had the Archbishop of Canterbury on the phone and the Prime Minister answering questions in the House of Commons on why his advisor thought God needed replacing. It was altogether very difficult. But my basic point was that in the modern era, the only social institution we can rely on to provide some of this is the school. In Britain in the past, 50 years ago, you could have relied on the church and the family and the school to bring a shared view of ethics. But now, the only social institution is the school. And the real issue, I think, for us is what I would think of as the social capital deficit. That even if you get your schools perfectly good academically, and we're all a long way from that, but even if you did, you'd still have a social capital question that would create inequities and big social problems. And so I think the next phase of education reform, in addition to school reform, which was what we were debating in the last session, we need to look at wider social policies that build social capital in those areas where it's not being built organically in communities. And I think that's the way into this question. And so there are various policies one could explore about how that might be done.
Yes.
I could perhaps add to that we have done a lot to improve the collaboration between the school and the parents, because we think that neither the school alone nor the parents alone can live up to take the responsibility for formulating this common ethos, or what you call it, this common ethical background that is needed. We have introduced a system whereby all teachers are obliged to, at least once a year, to give a status on each pupil in written form. It can be very short. We have not in the legislation given any specifications as to the content, but there's a rule that there should be a written status for each pupil. There was a tremendous protest from the teachers against this, but everybody is happy about it because it really works. It is something that has really improved the collaboration between the teachers and the school, and has made it much easier to have conversations on the development on the pupils. The introduction of ET has in many schools meant that the communication between the school and the parents have much improved. In many schools, all messages to the pupils are sent by internet, and the parents can look in the internet what their children are going to learn. There are messages about special events in the school. Everything is given by internet, and the parents can communicate with the school, with the teachers by internet. This has changed a lot and improved the collaboration between school and parents. Good.
Well, I think that this we have just touched briefly upon a topic. We haven't exhausted it. It's a very broad topic. It's part of any educational vision. It is an integral part of any educational policy. It has a lot of ideological, political, cultural contents, but we should be aware that it exists and cannot be ignored. And what I would like to do now is to refer to the last cluster of concepts that were discussed in the morning, and this is the question of the regulation of the whole system. Who is the system responsible to? Who controls and how the quality of the system? The issue of accountability was mentioned in the morning. Michael also added in the previous discussion that accountability is a very important element of any process of reform. And I would like to start this maybe by saying something more about accountability, because in the morning we had a question by Dr. Beller about models of accountability. She referred to lateral and vertical accountability, and I have asked Jose here, and she agreed to respond to that question. So your question will not remain unanswered. Yes.
Well, in the Netherlands, we do have lateral and vertical accountability. And I try to explain what we are trying to do. On vertical accountability, the schools have to make an annual report for the government or the inspection, etc. But it's just, they get a lot of money without any restraints, or almost no restraints, and they just have to do it on a global way, but we have to do to see what they have done. But on the other hand, there is the lateral accountability. The schools are responsible to also give this annual report to the parents, to the other stakeholders, and that consists more information. It can have the information about how the students do, how parents are involved in the system, how the students are involved in the system. So it's all kind of subjects that can be in this lateral accountability, and it's up to the parents, to the teachers, and all the other stakeholders to ask for the information they do want to have. So there is a lateral one, which is more precisely, and a more broad one on national level. I hope that's the answer to the question.
Who reads it?
Who reads it? We do, the accountants do, so that will be arranged. But I must say, we do have a problem to involve parents enough. It are always the same parents that are involved with the school, and the same parents who are less involved. We try to figure out systems to take them more into the school, to give them more responsibilities. And I think in later years, I think 20 years ago or something, it was almost normal that every parent was involved in school. Nowadays, parents have more to do, and I think it's we try to find certain projects, because parents do care, but they don't want to have a task, they have to deal with it on a yearly basis or whatsoever. So some parents do want to do that. Other parents, they want to be involved in projects. There are mothers who want to assist in reading hours, or they want to insist in other things, but make it small. Even small contributions make them involved in the school system.
The vertical?
In the vertical system?
Who reads the vertical reports?
The inspection reads it, and we do have an institution that provides the money. They give it because it's it has to be well done. Otherwise, they couldn't get their money for the next year anymore. So it's reading. It's read. Yeah.
Yes, Françoise.
Actually, I wanted to answer a question that was asked before about national curriculum, and I didn't say it before, because you wrote national standards and accountability, but national curriculum is different. National standards we don't have on every subject, it's just French and maths, because it's a huge job to define national standards at many levels, as I said. So we have French and maths, and languages, but that's on a European basis. We have defined standards in foreign languages. That's all. We wouldn't have national standards on philosophy. I mean, it's just unthinkable. But what you said about, isn't it a bit ridiculous to have a national curriculum? I think it's a good question. I say just what in France. It's one of our major features, more than national standards or accountability, because it's so big that we just, we are providers of a service, we are providers of a national curriculum, and we expect teachers to teach it, and we have inspectors, local inspectors, whose main job is to see that teachers teach the curriculum, okay? Now, the divide in our system is compulsory education, that's up to 15. I won't talk afterwards. But common education, compulsory education, we have one unique curriculum for every child. So, as you say, children are different, but the task of the ministry is to define what is common and compulsory for all children. And the reason why we still do it, and we do it even more than before, which may seem paradoxical, is, I would say, in the name of equal opportunities. Because I think, as the Irish colleague said, in many low-performing schools, the temptation is to have low expectations of children. And because we gave more money, in the 60s and 70s, and it was easier to have extra curricular activities. So they have money and they take the children out and they go to museums and to bridge the gap, the cultural gap or whatever. All well-intentioned. But what we measured, not with very sophisticated tests, but just inspectors said it, everywhere they had very low expectations. And in basic knowledge, they were really far behind. So we always had a national curriculum in France, but we are even more prescriptive in the core subjects than we were before. So it is a pressure on students. When many of them don't see the use of many things that they are taught. That's true, but you can't adjust the system on just people's expectations, and it's a pressure, and it's a pressure on teachers too, because as you said, there is such an amount of knowledge and skills in the world nowadays that although we pick up what we think is essential, it's still a lot in each subject. So it puts pressure on the system, but we think it's more democratic in a way, to define the minimum skills and knowledge that everyone has to master. So that's why we keep it.
Yes, Tony, you...
Schools are fascinating social institutions because they sit partway between families and indigenous communities and the larger civil society. They serve this important bridging function. as we think about school reform today, so much of the pressure comes from the larger society, concerns about equity, concerns about achievement for economic development, social mobility, and so on, all of which tends to direct our attention to strengthening the technical core of teaching and learning, which is absolutely correct. But there's the other side, which when you look at the schools as they connect back into families and indigenous communities, and those issues become especially germane when you look at schools that have very large concentrations of disadvantaged students, students from minority populations, students who historically have not been well served. And there, the problem also, often what we saw in our work in Chicago, was that basically this was an issue that local school professionals were disconnected from parents and community, and that when effective reforms actually occurred in those elementary schools, there was this second dimension to the improvement, which was that the local school professionals were, actually started with school leadership in particular, were really paying a lot of attention to strengthening those connections back into community. They were recruiting teachers who wanted to teach in those communities, and they made strengthening those relationships, that social capital back into community, an important part of the reform initiative. This issue about connecting to parents and community is an underaddressed issue, as we tend to focus primarily on the professional core, and especially when we talk about the education of disadvantaged students, it's a significant part of the issue, because so much of what teachers depend upon, that students come to school regularly, that they do homework, that they have an arrangement at home in which that homework occurs, that parents will support the work of teachers. All of this points you back into the relational dynamics about how school professionals relate to parents and community, particularly around the education of other people's children. And that becomes the other side, I think, of the accountability conversation when you talk about the horizontal rather than the vertical dimension of it. Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you very much. In Estonia, like in France, we have had always the national curricula, and I would like to say some words about that. So the national curriculum in Estonia determines the number of lessons in each subject during the school year, depending on the grade, of course. And on the basis of the national curricula, every school has its own curricula, which is registered in the Ministry of Education. The system is so that in the basic school, 80% of the subjects are determined by the national curricula, 20% are free for school, so they can choose depending on, let's say, the private schools. Are they more in schools going deeply more in realities or humanities or different? In the secondary education, it means beginning from the 10th year up to 12th year, the percentage is 60 is determined, 40 is free. So it means that the system gives quite a lot of flexibility to the schools to decide on themselves. And the measuring of the performance will take place at the end of the 9th year and at the end of the 12th year. It's the state test. But of course, at the end of every year, the school makes their own test to compare the students. Of course, there are also problems. So, as the ministry thinks that the schools have enough freedom, so the parents still say that there is too much for the children to learn. Too many lessons, too much homework. But in reality, well, when the children come home, the parents send them afterwards to language school, or to sports school, or to music school, or art school, or even several ones. So it means that in fact, they are giving even more tasks for the children to do than they receive from the normal general education. And at the same time, when we are talking about curricular reform, so the teachers say that definitely mathematics teachers say there are too few lessons for our subject, native language teachers say that there are too few lessons for us, physical education the same, so every teacher says that system is okay, but we have to, if we would put add at least one lesson per week, per hour, something. So this is a dilemma, and probably the truth is somewhere between. The only possible solution, maybe there are more possible solutions, but at least we have gone to that this 20% and this 40% just is the flexibility. So the schools are, they have the competency to decide whether to have more lessons in one subject, whether to have less, and of course they are talking with their parents, because every school has the parental committee, so on. So and even every class can choose somehow. Thank you.
Okay. The bad news is that on the agenda there is no coffee break at this session. The good news is that we shall conclude this the latest at 4 o'clock. And if there is no other, nobody wants to make a contribution to this subject, because we did, essentially it's already a summary. Oh, Ben, sorry. No, let me just conclude. So if you, after this round on this subject, I'll tell you what the procedure will be. We will begin summarizing, and then I'll explain to you the method of summarizing when we get to that. So first, Ben.
Well, comment on curriculum and a comment on assessment and accountability. The curriculum dilemma. The Ontario elementary school curriculum has 3,500 objectives in it. This is 2 objectives for every student every day for their 9 years of elementary schooling. It's totally impossible. We now have a committee that is trying to simplify the curriculum, but my guess is they will simplify it by adding several hundred new objectives. In a poll of Canadian parents that was done a few years ago, Canadian parents were asked which subjects should get more attention and which should get less. A majority of parents wanted all subjects to get more attention, but equally they did not want a longer school day or school year. This is the central conundrum around curriculum. Now, my own view of this is actually curriculum doesn't matter very much, because frankly it's what teachers do that matters, and that has a contingent relationship to the curriculum in most cases. And so personally I would not spend a lot of attention revising curricula. I would put all the effort into trying to help improve teaching skills and also the context in which those teaching skills are deployed. Now, on accountability, the challenge of accountability is this, that we are looking for measures that are, on the one hand, meaningful and real and seen as such by both teachers and the public. That is, we want indicators that educators believe are meaningful and that the public believes are meaningful. And on the other hand, we need them to be simple and easy to communicate. And those two things tend to bump up against each other. I would say that this is a much bigger issue in elementary schools than it is in secondary schools. In elementary schools, we have a lot of resistance from professionals, it's been mentioned today already, around using tests, which is what most of us use to communicate accountability. In secondary, many jurisdictions don't use one-off tests. We use the achievement of credentials or the accumulation of credits. So in Ontario, for example, our secondary school accountability measures are whether students are accumulating the credits they need in order to be on track to graduate. There is no resistance to those measures whatsoever from anybody. Not from parents, not from kids, not from teachers. Everybody accepts them. In elementary, where we're using tests, we have lots of problems, and not just with teachers, because there is quite a bit of evidence to show that parents also do not believe that one-off tests are good indicators of their kids' achievement. So I think the central accountability challenge is, what's the elementary equivalent of exam scores or credit accumulation in secondary that would have that kind of both professional and public acceptability? I don't have an answer to that question, but I'm not sure it's a question we've even asked. So I'd like to put that on the table. as something that we could think seriously about that would really help us on the accountability side. The detailed reports have merit, but then we have the problem, as Dan said, of who actually reads and uses them. So we need to look for some, and also they're very, very difficult to communicate publicly in a simple way. So I think that's part of the challenge we have on the accountability side.
Before you summarize, I would like to refer to
Yes.
accountability, with your permission.
You have my permission.
Yes. I will use my cafeteria voice. First of all, I want to make a confession. I hate the Hebrew translation of the word accountability, achrayutiyut. So, in case that...
First time I heard it.
Oh, that's bad, that's bad. You have to read the Hebrew subject matter. But I want to ask a question. Where does the accountability stop? Does it stop in the teacher's level, in the headmaster or the principal's level, on the supervisor, superintendent of schools, regional superintendent of schools, or the deputy director general, the
Minister of
General.
Education.
Of the minister, absolutely. In case that you will keep on using that expression, accountability, referring to the teachers, it will fail.
Okay, anybody wants to respond to that?
There is no response. You have
There is
to take into account that the minister is responsible.
There is a question. Now,
There's a response, right?
there is a response here. Then I will take one or two questions from the audience, and then I will conclude.
We just to answer that question quite directly, in 1998, when we set a very ambitious goals for literacy in English primary schools, the minister, in I think a television interview, said that his exact words were, "My head's on the block for delivering this target." And I met him afterwards, and I said, "Why on earth did you make that commitment?" And he said, "Because we're all accountable now. We have to change this relationship." And he said, "By the way, if I get fired, you're coming down with me." But there is an important point here.
No, this is not a joke.
No, I completely agree. I totally agree.
This is how it should be.
The difference between failing systems and successful systems is, in failing systems, everybody blames everybody else, and in successful systems, everybody takes responsibility for their own role in delivering the outcomes.
But regardless your country, by and large, whenever such people around this table talk about accountability, actually they exclude themselves. By definition. All right. This is my experience in my country.
Our chairman has the word now.
Unfortunately, all systems undertake responsibilities, they are accountable. But there's one guy, one girl who takes for accountability for all mistakes. It's a child himself. He's the only one who is tested, only one who is paying for the mistakes. Nobody else pays for any mistakes. He's the only one paying for every mistake. His own, his parents, his teachers, and the director general's mistakes as well.
Microphone. A remark from the audience, and then we begin summarizing.
My name is Varda Schiffer. I'm from the Mandel Foundation Israel. I just wanted to make a comment to try for myself, to summarize for myself some of the things that impressed me here, and I think that are connected both to centralization, decentralization, accountability, and to something which impressed me greatly and was said by the Finnish representative here. And I think, if I did not misunderstand him, he said that when the reform in Finland started, they needed a highly centralized system to implement the reform. And then when they wanted to make the reform sustainable, and here is my interpretation, adapted to perhaps changing environments, they needed to decentralize the system. Now, if I am very much into public management literature, and according to the literature, there is a very close link between the concept of accountability and acts of decentralization. And when we are talking about centralized systems, as we heard from the French delegate here, we're talking more about inspection systems. And what I wanted to say is that I was very much impressed, and I think it's a very important point, that to have that, and I think it's also linked to the first cluster here about the systemic changes, that we need to have some sort of infrastructure and a platform that would make it possible for us in Israel to think about this movement between centralization and decentralization in a much more structured way than we do now. Because one of the things that I think came out here from the Israeli comments is an incredible confusion about the allocation of authority, of responsibility, of who is accountable to whom, between the various authorities and stakeholders. And in Israel, it's also the non-profit organizations, which have a lot more influence than they actually have formal authority. So I think that's a very important issue to hear more about here. Thank you.
But very grateful for that. Actually, around this question, we could start the whole session now. And it's very good to keep it in mind. Regret that it came only at the end of the session. And I'm not asking for responses now. And I mentioned in my introductory remark that this whole session was based on a guideline paper, and the question there was, what do we want to achieve? And of course, what is meant by this question, what do we want to achieve by national education policy? But I suggested also to apply this question to this session. What did we want to achieve today? And now I can ask, what have we achieved? And what I suggest that we do, we started this morning by opening remarks from different countries, people sitting around this table. And I am now challenging you. I'll give you 1 minute, at most 2 minutes. Each of you trying to answer this question, namely, what have we achieved today? Have we learned anything new? Have we converged? Are there anything that we can...
This is the assessment now?
This is now, have we... Let's see how it works. And I'm not asking for volunteers. I mean, Ben, you were the first. How do you assess what we've done? I mean, let me pose a little more questions. I mean, I ask if we have converged, if there are any new concepts or a new way of speaking about the thing that we all have thought for many years. Is what has been said there enough material now to come up with a guideline paper that would be a very valuable guideline introduction to anybody who gets, to any of your successors in your position? So this is the set of questions. What have we achieved?
I was given when I was in grade 8, and I was a rather mouthy student, which I still obviously am, my teacher assigned me an essay which was on the subject of, if the fish wouldn't open its mouth, it wouldn't get caught. This is clearly a lesson I have still not learned. And in that regard, I think what I would want to say is that this is the beginning of a discussion rather than the conclusion of it. There are a whole set of very complicated issues here. There's a huge amount of experience and knowledge in the room, and I think given that we've had a few hours together, it would be very surprising had we got past where I think we are, which was some initial exchange around some of the ideas and some interesting and provocative perspectives.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I think the discussions have been very interesting, and but still it's very complicated. These questions are very complicated. I was thinking about the differences between Finland and Sweden, for example. We heard the Finnish description of how they reformed and how they did. And I could have made almost the same description. We did the same thing. I think we did it a little bit earlier, even 10 years earlier. We introduced a comprehensive, compulsory school. We did the same way. Well, yeah. Still, there's very much that differs in the end. And our results, our outcome is not as good as it is in Finland. And of course, I know there are certain differences in how the teacher training, teachers training, recruitment of teachers, but still very much is the same. And it's really very hard to explain why the difference is that big.
Well, I was thinking that probably as we were your guests, the interesting question perhaps is more what you felt you got out of us, as opposed to maybe what we felt we kind of concluded. I would agree with what was said. It's a short period to discuss. I am intrigued. I'd love to know why the Swedish one didn't work and the Finnish one did. So I'm left with some questions like that. I suppose for myself, there are probably two messages. Is how, given that as a Secretary General, are we accountable enough, and are we actually close enough to the schools? And perhaps that issue of the deliverability chain when we introduce reform that Michael Barber referred to, is when we decide to do things, are we connected enough in the design, and do we look enough at the how we deliver as well as the what we deliver?
I learned three things, three lessons. One, that we live in a global village. Challenges are more or less similar. Solutions are quite different, and it all depends on the specific content and culture and environment of each village. Second lesson that I learned is a warning. Those of the present people here who still remember the 60s and the 70s, not as students at kindergarten or primary school, but those who were adults, remember the paradigm of Coleman. You couldn't make any conference on education during the 60s and the 70s without referring to Jim Coleman, to the whole theory. We are now living through a paradigm shift, and I am afraid that we'll remember the first decade of the 21st century as the McKinsey paradigm, and I have a little bit of a suspicion regarding the experience of the paradigm shift from Coleman. Last lesson that I learned is from Finland. Maybe by accident, you mentioned that the reform that you are now enjoying its fruits started in 1968. The same year, in 1968, we have started our big reform that hasn't yet been accomplished. And all the rest is history.
Yes.
Okay. Well, what we have achieved today, I think we are just in a discussion. We need, I think, a few more years to really get it. What I have heard today, that Israel has a very complex system, has but I think most of the countries of we are here have a complex system, but Israel even more, I suppose. If you look at educational people, if they are teachers, policymaker, or whatever, they're all very involved people, and those people already, they try to change the world in just one day. That's not different in Israel from somewhere else in other countries. And I think what makes it clear to me, because of this discussion, I'm more certain on focusing than I even was before. Because if we want to change the world really in one day, I think we will get less further than without focusing. Thank you.
Thank you. What I have learned here is, I try not to repeat very much, but I will have to repeat the former speeches. The system and situation here is definitely very complicated. And although here around the table is very much knowledge about education policy from all over the world, still the problems have to be solved here. Because we are not the people who in reality understand the situation so thoroughly that we can help. We can only talk about our experience, what we have been doing. But in every country it is very different. So probably the Israeli colleagues, the best for them is to listen, to write down, and afterwards to discuss between each other and to find common agreement. Finding common agreement is probably the most complicated here. It takes time, as we heard from the example of Finland also. Maybe it will take here even more time. But if there is no agreement, probably there will be no good solution. But just to conclude with optimistic words, I would say that if the present politicians and if the present parents and ministerial civil servants will not come to this agreement, the next generation, which today is in the same school system, which you want to reform, they will find the agreement and they will make the decisions, but it will be after some years.
Sure. Well, I think we have made a whole range of subjects and identified many problem areas that have to be taken into account. I also think that we have gained an understanding that if we want to work deeper with these problems, we have to analyze them more thoroughly. We have been discussing many problems under a name without identifying what we meant with this name. I can give an example. We have been discussing national standards. If one had to balance the pros and cons of national standards, I think it's necessary to be much more specific about what kind of standards you are talking about, what is the content, are the national standards combined with obligatory teaching material, or is there freedom for the teacher, just to give an example. And then I'll say I found a big comfort in the experience that discussions which have covered a lot of ground, many subjects, and from time to time may have seemed somewhat chaotic, perhaps. Already, although it has been able, although to make a more systematic overview of this discussion, and thus forming a good platform for the further work.
The teacher behave, feel, and demonstrate and perform as really professional leaders. We just have to find the ways out to do.
Yes. Thank you very much. For me personally, it was a very interesting meeting. Thank you very much for it. I think that we discussed the topics from different point of views, and I would like to mention one key word which was mentioned during our discussion many times. I mean teacher. We discussed teacher from different point of views, from a real role of the teacher in the system, a role of the teacher in education, and so on. The Czech Republic celebrates this year 20 years after the Velvet Revolution. And in this period, we had, I tried to count it now, over 13 ministers of education. And I think that every minister came with good or bad idea and said the teacher has to play a key role in implementation of my idea. So I think that we, for the future, we should think about it, and we shouldn't forget that we have to avoid their patience of teachers to be ready to implement our future ideas. And that's what I bring from this discussion.
Well, I think, like most colleagues, I was particularly interested in listening to Israeli colleagues, because we know each other in Europe. We meet often. American system we know a little bit too, because there is a big literature about the education system. But I didn't know much, and I still don't know much about the Israeli system. And I can see there is debate, but you don't see there are debates at home, because there's one representative of each country here. But it would be the same if we were many, representatives of each country. So I hope in the 2 days that come we can learn a little more about your system, because I'm not sure I quite understand all your issues, your major issues. So, well, otherwise, it's, as you said, education is dealing about the future of the country, so it's always very highly political, so controversial, and you have to make decisions. Your topic was focusing on educational implementation of reforms. So what I would like to say that systems and reforms is not exactly the same. Sometimes reforms fail, but it's a good thing, because the reform was bad. So you have to look in the long run, and see what education systems provide. And it takes time to describe, each particular system.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this discussion was an excellent start. Certainly it was not, it didn't reach the end, not even the beginning of the end, perhaps only the end of the beginning. I have learned 3 things. First, the principles and practical solutions of educational reforms cannot be transferred from one country to another. Second, referring to what I said in the beginning, I do not know whether we in Finland are doing the right things at the moment. Someone else will be able to assess it after 20 or 30 years. And the third point, which I have learned, whatever reform you do, you have to involve all the stakeholders in preparation of the reform. Then the stakeholders will also commit themselves to the implementation of the reform. And finally, I would like to pick up two paragraphs from our Basic Education Act to summarize what I think is the most important thing here. According to the Section 2 of the Basic Education Act, the purpose of education is to support pupils' growth into humanity and into ethically responsible membership of society, and to provide them with knowledge and skills needed in life. So that's the core. But there's another point. According to the same section, the aim of education shall further be to secure adequate equity in education throughout the country.
Thank you.
I wasn't sure how far we're going around the table. I'm actually a bit more sanguine about the conversation today than maybe others, in that I actually think we've begun to articulate some common ground or principles, a systems view of what transformation of education entails, and therefore what policy really needs to aim at. While we might disagree on some of the specifics, the elements that form this system view, what we might call the McKenzie doctrine, I think there was something approaching consensus on. What is very local, however, is really political strategy. What's actually possible to accomplish in a country, depending upon the degree of its internal diversity and the stability of its governing systems. That's a whole different dimension of the conversation than what you'd like to accomplish. The question of the political how versus the substance of the what. And that, I think, is a different issue for further conversation.
I had the experience of teaching courses on religion and secularization for many. Am I on? Yes. I had the experience of teaching courses on religion and secularization for many years at the university, and I can tell you that the country that my students understood the best over 20 years was mid-19th century France. That means that we lived in a country that is riven by the debate between Catholicism, between religion and secularity, and that also has a great degree of bureaucratic centralism. And those are poles of the Israeli discussion as opposed to discussions in other countries. In addition, we have a typically East European national conflict, which we have not discussed today, but which has to be understood. It is an ethnic conflict and not a state conflict, and that's important. The reason is that I found very interesting specifically the discussion of parallel tracks to those countries in which you have Catholic French and Catholic non-French, and with 4 different parallel kinds of offerings in the education system, because one of the things we worry about constantly is, are we providing the same education or the same core in the different parallel tracks? What is the degree to which we can unify core elements between the different tracks? And we can't. That's a major specific issue. And I think that one of the things I understood from this is that we here are going to perhaps have an internal discussion pretty soon on having some kind of workshop on the politics of education, which is part of the implementation of all this. Now, I also learned a lot about complex systems, and especially about the consent of stakeholders, specifically the consent of teachers and the consent of students. I think we did not hear enough about pupils and what it means for them to consent to be in the system and to learn from it. And I think that's a point that we have to think about.
Michael, what have you learned in addition to teaching us a lot today?
Well, thank you very much. I've certainly learned a lot about Israel and the challenges facing Israel from a position of very considerable ignorance before I arrived yesterday. And I've just done the first level of that, and I would love to be part of that wider debate. I began by talking about professionalisation of system reform, and the way I agree with all the other things that have been said, and we've learnt a lot from each other. There is a convergence in understanding the challenges we all face. There is a convergence in understanding some of the things that work. But also, I totally agree with Tony Reich and other colleagues that a lot of the politics of education reform is going to be context-specific and system-specific, and we can still learn from each other, but it's complicated. But if I can finish with a metaphor, if you think of reforming education systems as a large dark room with a lot of nooks and crannies and corners, I think we've switched on a couple of table lamps that have thrown a bit of light here and there. We've opened the window, we've drawn the curtains back a little bit, but there's still some murky, dark corners that we haven't quite fully understood yet.
Thank you. Now, Zeev Tadmor, who chaired the morning session, was also the chairman of the team that prepared this whole workshop. And I'd like just challenge Zeev to tell us if he's happy with the result. You have 2 minutes. Come up here. Come up here. No, he should be visible.
If I am happy with the results, yes. I wish we could keep you longer for a week and have real discussions, broken up in smaller teams and workshops and so on, so that we can, and I hate that expression, pick your brains for me. Okay? But I want to say from a personal point of view, yes, I am happy. But I learned that one thing, apparently I was wrong. I learned something that gives some hope, and then I learned something that is rather discouraging. I was wrong apparently on what I pointed out in the morning, that I felt that there is a limited pool of talent of teachers, and that we have a problem with expanding systems. Now, that was from personal experience. When I went to elementary school in this country, we are 5 kids in the school. We have a couple of teachers. One of them became a very well-known writer, so it was good quality. In high school, when I went to high school, we had a few teachers, and later I found them in universities. So there is, with the expanding system, including the higher education system, talent is extracted from the regular education system into the education system, and that I thought may create a problem. The same with women. Before the society opened up for careers of talented women, there were a lot of talented women teaching. Now there are less. Based on that, I thought that perhaps we have a systemic problem with supplying enough good teachers to the education system. But here I learned that with enough investment, perseverance, and constant attention, yes, you can improve teaching on a large scale in schools. So I was wrong on that. I learned. I hope I'm right now. I learned. You straightened me out. I learned on that. That's good. I learned that all of us sense that we live in a very complex world. It's a global world where people are moving freely. People, talent, technologies, everything is moving freely across borders. And that creates very difficult issues for educational system. How to maintain tradition, history, culture, and supply the needs of a modern world, and cope with all the problems of demography, of religions and belief. That we share. I was happy to see that in many of the countries represented here, that leads to some extent the tightening of standards nationwide, which I think it's a good thing, and which I hope Dr. Shoshani, who is not here, is going to do in this country also, because we went to a system where there's a cafeteria of courses, no real standards, and we have a problem there. Now, where I became a little bit more disappointed or concerned, is that what in your countries are problems that are difficult to solve or can be solved only very, very slowly. In this country, these problems are existential problems. That unless we solve them, this nation is at risk in the future. Unless we integrate completely the Arab society into the Arab sector into the Israeli society, which moves very, very slowly. Unless we bring the ultra-Orthodox people to learn a core of knowledge by which they can contribute to the society, we put the nation at risk. To accomplish both these goals, you need political will that is non-existent at this time in the country. So that listening to you and looking at us, I am leave concerned, but optimistic on 2 points. Thank you.
Now is the time for me to perform the function which gives me a great pleasure to do, and that is to express gratitude to the institutions and individuals who should be thanked on this occasion. And as you know, this workshop and the conference that will begin tonight, last for the next 2 days, was initiated, organized and sponsored by 2 institutions, the Van Leer who is the third? Oh. That I take for granted. The municipality of Jerusalem I took for granted. Anyway, so I should also add, but first the Van Leer Institute and its director, Professor Gabi Motzkin, whom you have met, you saw, you heard, and you will see more of him in the course of this conference. Then there is the organization. Everything is education. hakol חינוך, which is also a powerful statement. Not education is everything, but everything is education, and this is an organization that was founded and is chaired by Mr. Dov Lautman, whom you will meet tonight, and I extend to him, to the organization, our gratitude, appreciation. And the last, which I have forgotten to mention, was reminded, is the municipality of Jerusalem and the mayor, Mr. Nir Barkat, whom we expected to meet yesterday, but I hope we shall see him when, tonight or tomorrow, sometime. Then, again, I want to thank the individuals who were the organizing team, or at least the head of the organizing team, and again, Professor Gabi Motzkin from the Van Leer Institute, Professor Dan Inbar here, whom I shall in a minute call to the podium, and Mr. Ronen Goffer, who coordinated all the logistics and the program. It's the first time I've participated in many conferences, I've chaired many such debates. It's the first time that I'm performing under very close, very strict instruction and surveillance by the people who represent here this Praxis company, and they invented the method according to which all the concepts that are raised are immediately mapped, and we develop a kind of conceptual map. And if we had a little more time, we could talk about, every map has a certain metrics, there are distances between concepts. If we put them in the right place, what do we learn from distribution in space of words and concepts? So it's the first time I begin to like it. It's almost like a game, and I am grateful to the company, to Praxis, and Merav Zonstein, who was here typing everything you said, and she is the title of Ideas Hunter. So she was supposed to pick up the ideas of the concept that you mentioned, so I'm grateful to all of them, and let's give all the people, institutions I mentioned. And before I conclude, I would like to call to the podium Professor Dan Inbar and to say a few words. You want to do it from there? You want to come to the podium?
I'm hesitating.
You are hesitating. It's too late. It's too late now.
2 points, several small minor points. First of all, I'm happy that Zev and Hanoch are happy. You wouldn't believe what I went through when I told them. So if they are happy now, I'm more happy than they are. Now I learned several things. On minor scale, you can accomplish a vision. You can accomplish. Such that we are here, it's a small minor. I learned another lesson. There's a difference between different countries. Finland told us that they have a 30-year reform. It's unheardable in our countries that you have one idea for 30 years. Difference between countries. But it's more than that, it's a time. Many, many years back in 73, in the Yom Kippur War, I remember myself being caught in a heavy rainy night with somebody that I don't know his name, he doesn't know my name, we don't know each other. And we're talking, and he said, complained about the educational system. And I said, what we did in 25 years, it's unheardable all around the world. We not 6 times, 10 times increased our school population. And I convinced him, with all my academic rhetoric, how good we accomplished, what we accomplished in 15, 25 years, 15 or 25 years. He heard me, listened to me, then he said, do you have kids? I said, yes, I have 2 daughters. I have also 2 daughters. What is your daughter going to do? How old is she? She said 16. What is going to do? She's probably ending her high school and going to university. And he said, look, I'm here 10 years. I was a new immigrant. Nobody waited for me for one generation, 2 generation to recruit to the military service to sit with you here in the rain. I don't want to wait 20 years for my daughter to join your daughter. I want her to go with your daughter tomorrow. So time is something that we have to consider. In a more humoristic way, we have a stadium, Teddy Collop Stadium, and we wanted to have green grass, you know, like Wembley in London, soft green grass. So we sent a delegation to London and asked them, what do you do? He said, very simple. You plant grass, you cultivate it, cut it, water it. That's what we did. After 2 years, the delegation will return and complain. There's still dirt. And how many years do you do it? 3. Do it 200 years. So time is. And then I listened to the people and I heard Zeev left is a graduate of his excellent school system of the 60s. This school system didn't have standards. So I wonder why should we improve our school system with standards and not before? So we are looking for solutions that we didn't have them by ourselves. Another point, I listened to all of us and I realized that we have many problems. Many problems. Very many problems. But I heard that we have many answers as well. And when we listened more carefully, I got the feeling that we have even more answers than problems. And still I wonder why we don't accomplish what we want to do. Last thing is, I want to refer to Michael, who said about the system. We had classroom evaluation, classroom system, school system, nationwide system. I have the feeling that our discussion touches the edges of a nationwide, international-wide educational system. The teams in PISA are an example that we are comparing ourselves to international system. So we might evaluate our own systems, but talk about international educational system. And just imagining going from one university to another is international system. I think that we'll end up with it, and we'll meet together this evening with the President. Many thanks again.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you all for your patience, and see you in the evening. Bye. Bye-bye.